So let's set the scene. There's the prophet Elijah, perhaps the greatest prophet in the Hebrew tradition of prophets. And there's this widow of Zarephath. And there's this woman named Jezebel. And there's King Ahab. Now Jezebel, you may not know much about, but that name, Jezebel, still is recalled. People get called Jezebel. There's a website, Jezebel, that you can go to that's full of interesting essays written by feminists. The word Jezebel has come to take on the meaning of a temptress, of somebody who goes after somebody else's man, somebody else's husband. So what's happening here is that Ahab was the king of Israel, the northern kingdom. Samaria was the capital of that northern kingdom, and Ahab lived there with Jezebel, who was, quote, a bad person, some sort of temptress. And we find out earlier in the story, setting the scene, that King Ahab had taken Jezebel, who was a foreign pagan woman who worshipped other gods. He had made Jezebel his wife. But that's not all. He had also begun worshiping her gods. And he even built a temple to Baal, the god Baal, who was the god of storms and rain, and was worshiping Baal right there in Israel. And he led the people astray. This is the king of Israel, leading his own people into the worship of a foreign god, the god of his wife, who he seems to be somewhat afraid of, to be honest about it. So, Ahab, we don't know whether he really believed in Baal, or whether he was like, well, it can't hurt to have another god to pray to. We really need rain. Let me cover all my bases here. And so he begins the worship of Baal. Now, if you're living in California right now, or out west, where there's a terrible drought, you know what it's like to go day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, with not enough rain. And you begin to worry about the crops, and you're going to have to, figure out what to do in this terrible drought. Everything starts to feel dusty and dry, and wildfires begin to break out. Now remember, it's a very agrarian economy, and it's surrounded by desert. And so the people were beginning to panic. How are they going to eke out an existence? How are they going to have a crop without rain? If they don't have a crop, then they can't eat. If they can't eat, they're going to starve to death and die. So, maybe Ahab was pliable in this situation when Jezebel came and said, hey, you go to worship Baal. He can make a difference here. And Ahab said, oh, why not? In any case, Ahab gives in. And I love the way Eugene Peterson translates, in his translation, The Message, when he described all the kings of Israel. He described Ahab in this way: Ahab did even more open evil before God than anyone yet. He was a new champion in evil. Ahab is remembered as one of the bad kings, the unfaithful kings of Israel. Now onto the scene comes the prophet Elijah. Elijah is not happy at all with Ahab because he knows that God is not happy with Ahab, and this false God worship has got to stop. So he speaks truth to power the way you would expect a prophet to do. He tells Ahab that he is in big trouble, that he should stop this worship of Baal. There's a major drought coming, and we will see who's really in charge of things. Elijah says to the king, not your wife's petty little god, Baal, but the one true God, Yahweh of Israel. And right away, the very next line in the Bible, the one true God of Israel says to Elijah, good, now you better get out of town for a while. Because things are going to get rough. Jezebel, not going to be happy Now, Jezebel's not happy, Ahab's not happy, you're in trouble, by the way. So, best to get out of town, Elijah, maybe way out of town. So Elijah heads off into the wilderness, and there God provides everything that he needs, food and water, at least for a while. And then comes today's story. God tells Elijah to head to, of all places, Sidon. Now, who lives in Sidon? Jezebel. Right? A place of pagans, a place of foreigners. There's nobody there that's Jewish. None of Elijah's own kind. None of his own people. And God gives this mysterious instruction. Go, take refuge amongst a bunch of strangers who possibly hate you. Now, if you got a word from the Lord that said that, what would you do? It gets stranger, because God says, not only do I want you to go to Sidon, I want you to stay there with a widow, not the Ritz, not the Crown Royal, not the Hilton. I want you to stay with a widow there in Zarephath. Now, Zarephath was kind of a suburb of Sidon. You can't get much closer to nowhere and nobody than that. It's like that movie, you know, this isn't the middle of nowhere, but you can sure see it from here, right? He's in the middle of nowhere, foreign territory. He's in Jezebel's territory, enemy territory, and he's now with a widow, of all things. And you have to remember that widows in that day, and still today, right, lived on the edge of survival. If a woman in that time did not have a husband, if she was unfortunate enough to have her husband die, if she didn't have a son or a father or some male to protect her, she was in big trouble. She didn't have many alternatives. If you were a widow, you could turn to begging, or you could turn to prostitution. Or if you were lucky enough, maybe, if you were well-liked, the community would rally around you and support you. Those were pretty much your options if you were a widow. You remember the story of Ruth that comes at a different time in the Bible, when Ruth is widowed and her two daughters are also, her two sons die, and her daughter-in-laws, and they're stranded in this foreign land. Widows have a tough road to hoe. And so, it seems an odd choice, doesn't it, for God to make when Elijah is in need. But the prophet went where he was told to go. And it reminds me that some of the best stories in the Bible seem to happen in these out-of-the-way places where no one is expecting anything. As a matter of fact, now that I think about it, Nazareth was kind of like that. They said of Nazareth in the Galilee, can anything good come out of Nazareth? And Jesus came from Nazareth. These out-of-the-way, dangerous, uncomfortable places filled with people who are living on the margins. And yet, surprisingly, God has something in mind. So Elijah goes to Zarephath. He finds the widow. And this is where it really gets interesting. He asks her for food and water. Well, the widow has almost nothing. So little that she and her son were just about ready to give up and die. After they had shared their last little bit of food, they were ready to die. But she says, with amazing faith, this foreigner, this pagan, we will give you what we have. Man of God. And what does Elijah say? He says what we keep hearing over and over and over in the Bible because we continue to need to hear it. He says, do not be afraid. There is going to be more than enough. God is going to provide everything that you need. And amazingly, that's just what happened. There was grain and oil for the widow and her son, and for their house guest, the prophet, all the way through the last day of the drought. Because God is not a God of scarcity. Don't be believing that. God is a God of abundance. And God will provide for God's people. Now, if the story ended there, we would all go out of here thinking, what an amazing and wonderful story. But the son of the widow, you remember him, all that this woman had in the world suddenly gets sick and dies. So the good news turns into bad news. Just like that. You ever have that happen in your life? Good news turns to bad news. In the click of a finger or a phone call. The widow maybe thought, boy, I knew this was too good to be true. It takes courage, after all, to hope. She had risked everything in giving that last little morsel of bread. She had the courage to hope. And just when she let herself be vulnerable enough to hope, the worst thing imaginable happens. Friends, have you ever been there? Have you ever felt that you've lost the ability to hope any longer because you've been disappointed so many times? You don't even remember how to hope? And of course the widow is understandably upset with, guess who? Elijah. And she thinks that it's Elijah's fault that her son has died, because she's just connecting the dots, right? Things weren't so great before you came here, but now my son's dead. Thanks a lot. You get the feeling that she thought that Elijah the prophet brought death rather than life, brought despair rather than hope. And I think that Elijah felt her pain in such a way that he unleashes one of the most amazing prayers that must have ever been prayed. And from the sound of Elijah's prayer, you get the idea that Elijah is daring to suggest to Yahweh that Yahweh has treated this poor widow just like everybody else. He's disappointed in God. Everybody else abandoned her. She has nothing. And what did you do, God? You let her son die. What's wrong with you? So in a way, the prophet challenges God. But more than that, the prophet somehow has the courage to trust God. That even in the darkest time, God will make a way where there is no way. And so he prays hard. Have you ever been in that situation? He prays hard. And there we have it. Another resurrection story. Which is why this is a great story for Easter season. The young man is raised out of death into life. From scarcity and lack come abundance. From death comes life. How many times have we seen this happen? A few years ago, I was asked to offer a prayer at a Relay for Life event in Ohio, trying to raise money for cancer research. And it was there that I met a young girl named Emily. survivor. With her shaved head and her baseball cap, she looked like a skinny little boy. But she's a girl, very much a girl, who came back from death into life. And I watched her interact with the people, many of them strangers, who were there to raise money for her and for other cancer survivors. And I thought to myself, this is a story of resurrection. Emily was restored to her family, to her grieving mother. And now what is she doing? Sitting at home, playing video games? No. She's out there telling her story as a proud survivor so that other little girls and boys can have hope and have life. Giving hope to others who have this terrible disease, letting them know that hope still lives, that there's life in the midst of death, and there's abundance in the midst of scarcity. And miracles still happen in this world if we just know where to look for them. Oh, this poor widow and her son must have felt alone and at the end of their resources at many points in this story. But right there in the midst of desperation and scarcity is abundance. Abundance of caring, abundance of compassion, abundance of love. Even the love of strangers, which is the most amazing kind of love of all. Overflowing compassion can completely transform a situation of hatred, cruelty, and violence. Not long ago, right here in this church, we had a service of healing. You remember? And we anointed with oil and laid hands on people and prayed and blessed them. And the oil of God's compassion is unending, friends. It will never run out. It flows through you and me. It flows through my hands and your hands into each other. We can choose to be healers. We can choose compassion over shutting down. We can choose to make a difference, to offer a word of encouragement and hope to someone who is beaten down, pushed out, broken, and heartsick. Well, there are amazing stories in the Bible about prophets like Elijah, about Jesus himself, and every story of compassion is an amazing story because we humans have a tendency, don't we, to look after number one, right? Me, myself, and I. We especially think we shouldn't have to think too much about people who are beyond our own circle. People outside the walls of the church or outside our acquaintance comfort level. But the story of Elijah is a story of strangers caring about other strangers. People who reach out in compassion time and time again to those who were beyond their own circle. Every 12-step program is like this. Strangers helping strangers, right? Beggars saying to other beggars, I found bread. Let me show you where. Come with me. And when you bring somebody to worship with you and say, I will sit next to you, come with me to church, I will worship with you, that's exactly what you're doing. You're bringing people to the place where they can be blessed, where they can be healed, and where they can find hope. Jesus is the man for others, the one who understands and embraces and embodies the great dream of God, that the most unlikely people are welcome in this place. And that dream is one that we are called to follow.